Previously on Ramblings with Rebecca, we had housekeeping, the multiple definitions of the phrase trope, and, most recently, props. I don't have the props today, but you may remember from episode 5 that we talked about dichotomy. Dichotomous thinking is a way of classifying groups such that all of the members of the group are categorized into either A or B. They can't be members of both groups, and they have to be in one. But again, it's one or the other. It is A or B, either or. Dichotomous thinking, in my view, tends to trap us into a binary way of seeing the world, such that things are 1 or 0 instead of the beautiful, gray, blurry line mess that I think makes life so wonderfully fun. Dichotomies, especially when, applied to humans and cultures and societies and the world at large, I think tend to help further pre-existing power relations and just generally aren't helpful for a truly delightful society. So today, we're going to talk about one possible way to break down dichotomies. I'm Rebecca Farnum. This is Ramblings with Rebecca. Welcome to episode 6, Dialectic. The idea of dialectic was first made popular by this guy you may have heard of. His name was Plato. He lived a long time ago. Yeah, and originally, dialectic was this method of argument for disagreement, such that when two or more parties had an argument, they would have a rational discourse that was intended to bring them closer to the truth through reasoned arguments. For Plato, dialectic was very specifically not debate, so it was not focused on emotional arguments or pulling in anecdotes about, the sad children and the harried father, etc., etc., but instead was rational. Now, I tend to see this whole emotional versus rational as yet another dichotomy that needs breaking down, but the truth was very important to folks like Plato. For more on truth, we'll do an epistemology episode later on. But for now, back to dialectic. For Plato, very specifically not debate, also that's very specifically not dealing with rhetoric. That is, the way to turn a phrase to win someone to your way of thinking. That is, dialectics were not supposed to use things like trope. See how I did that? Connections. Delightful. Anyway, moving past Plato a few hundred years, dialectic is now also seen as a way to avoid dualistic thinking. That is, by being trapped by ideas of mutually exclusive categories and into dichotomous thinking, trying to move past that. Probably the most well-known dialectic way of thinking today is known as the Hegelian dialectic. It's also used by folks like Immanuel Kant and Baruch Spinoza. In the Hegelian dialectic, there are 3 components. 1 is the thesis, the initial argument or idea. 2, some kind of idea or counter-argument or alternate narrative, etc. comes along that contradicts or somehow challenges the thesis. This is called the antithesis or antithesis, if you will. There is then a tension between thesis and antithesis. Eventually, the idea is that this tension becomes resolved and becomes synthesis. Synthesis, as in new, right? So thesis and antithesis tense up together and eventually resolve to create something new. There is some kind of resolution. We also see something that previously, when we were clinging really, really hard to thesis or really, really hard to antithesis, we couldn't have seen as existing. Hegel never actually used this explicit thesis, antithesis, synthesis language in his arguments, but most of the framework is present in a lot of his arguments, and it was named after him, as philosophers tend to do. This idea of a Hegelian dialectic is trying to make the implicit contradictions that are present in a lot of arguments and rationales explicit. It's trying to avoid dualism, and it's also trying to see past extremes. So through the dialectic, we help find some relationship between two things that were previously thought of as separate, distinct, unrelated. We see the give and take in life. And that's what we're going to try and do in the next several episodes of Ramblings with Rebecca. We'll encounter the dichotomies of nature versus culture, West versus rest, male versus female, along with some sex and gender, and maybe I will do the rational versus emotional. Is there another dichotomy that you'd like to talk about? Throw it out there. Comment, tweet, Facebook, make a video, whatever you'd like. let's encounter dichotomies.